Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Have you ever looked at a family tree and thought, okay, what is the actual science hiding in here? Well, if so, you're in exactly the right place. Today we're building a visual, logical toolkit to decode the secrets hidden in inherited traits, literally just by observing patterns. Think of it like a giant biological puzzle. So let's dive right into this masterclass.
We've got four main topics on our agenda today. First, what is a pedigree? Second, tracking trait inheritance. Third, dominant or recessive traits. And finally, autosomal or sex-linked traits. This is basically our roadmap for the biological toolkit we're about to build together.
All right, let's kick things off with section 1. What exactly is a pedigree?
By definition, a pedigree is a family tree annotated with a standardized genetic nomenclature. Now, I really want to slow down and highlight those last few words, standardized genetic nomenclature. We aren't just talking about a casual back-of-the-napkin sketch of who married whom or who had which kids. By applying a very specific, standardized system of symbols, we totally upgrade a simple family tree into a rigorous scientific document. In this visual language, standard practice uses squares for males and circles for females. And when a shape is shaded in, that means someone actually expresses the specific trait we're tracking. It basically becomes this precise visual tool that researchers use to communicate really complex genetic information in an instant. Moving right along to section 2, tracking trait inheritance.
Now that we know what a pedigree is, you might be wondering, why go through all the meticulous effort of making one? Well, the core purpose is to follow the inheritance of a trait through a family. We take this scientific document and carefully trace a very specific characteristic as it travels generation after generation. It's honestly exactly like being a biological detective. You're following visual clues left behind in the family tree to figure out where a trait started and where it's going next. You could be tracking something totally common, like freckles, or maybe a specific genetic condition like colorblindness.
To pull this off effectively, we use a super straightforward step-by-step procedure. Step 1, look at the family tree. Step 2, check for skipping generations. And step 3, check for sex bias. It really is that beautifully simple. For the rest of this explainer, we're going to focus entirely on mastering steps 2 and 3. These two steps are absolutely crucial. They are your primary investigative tools to decode literally any pedigree.
Which brings us to section 3, dominant or recessive traits. This corresponds directly to step 2 of our procedure.
To solve this first genetic mystery, we just have to ask one incredibly powerful question. Does it skip generations? When you're looking at your annotated family tree, you track the trait and simply ask yourself, does this show up in every single generation in a continuous line, or does it vanish in one generation and then suddenly pop back up in the next? The answer to that single question unlocks our first major genetic categorization. Let's compare the two possible outcomes here. You determine a trait is dominant by asking if it cannot skip generations. If the trait appears totally unbroken, passing straight from parent to child without ever hiding, boom, you've got a dominant trait. They simply cannot hide. If the gene is present, it's visually expressed. On the flip side, you determine a recessive trait by asking if it can skip generations. If you see a trait vanish in a generation of parents, only to reveal itself again in their kids, it's skipped, which means it's recessive. It can skip generations because it safely hides behind a dominant gene in the parents, but then reveals itself when two hidden copies happen to combine in the offspring. It's fascinating. All right, on to our final step, section 4, autosomal or sex-linked traits. Here's the big question for this one. Is there a sex bias in inheritance? This is our final investigative tool. Think back to those standard symbols we talked about earlier. Look at all the squares and circles. Is the trait distributed pretty evenly among them, or is the pattern heavily skewing toward just the males or just the females? Based on that, we categorize these as either autosomal traits or sex-linked traits. Autosomal traits are determined by a lack of sex bias. If you look at the pedigree and see the trait affecting both males and females without any overwhelming preference, it's autosomal. That's because autosomal traits sit on your standard non-sex chromosomes. So the scales naturally stay balanced between males and females. Sex-linked traits, on the other hand, are determined by actually observing a sex bias in inheritance. If the trait predominantly shows up in just one sex on the tree, you've successfully identified a sex-linked trait. Since these specific traits are usually tied directly to the X or Y chromosomes, they naturally show up way more often in one sex over the other. So all of this begs the question, what hidden traits might be lurking in your own annotated family tree?
Now that you know exactly how to hunt for skipped generations to find recessive or dominant traits, and how to spot sex biases for autosomal or sex-linked traits, I challenge you to look at your own family history with the eyes of a genetic detective. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer masterclass today. Keep asking those great questions and have fun decoding the science hiding all around you.